We welcome you to our study on the book of Colossians again today. We've been in Colossians for several sessions, and the last couple of sessions we've been focused on verse number 7 of chapter 1. So let me read it. As ye also learned of Epaphras, our dear fellow servant, who is for you a faithful minister of Christ. It's a joy to me to dig into some of these men that are mentioned in the Bible just briefly. They're not the Apostle Paul, they're not Luke's, they're not John's, they're not Peter's, but they're mentioned briefly, and there's so much we can learn from them. And so we've been looking at Epaphras for the last couple of sessions. Started off by comparing him to a modern day missionary that I've known for decades, really, and who is well up in years now, but has faithfully served God for nearly 70 years. And a missionary by the name of Bob Smith lives down on the Texas-Mexican border and served so many years in Mexico and in Peru at one time. But we started out just talking about him for a minute. Now I won't go back to that, and then some other things about Epaphras. But what we've seen about Epaphras in this section is, first of all, his relationship to other believers. He's called a dear fellow servant. And then we talked about his responsibility to Christ. He was a faithful minister of Christ. Today, I want to pick up the last two thoughts about Epaphras and discuss them. One is his commitment to Christ. Now move over, if you will, in Colossians to chapter number 4 and verse 12. We'll leave verse 7 for a minute. But in chapter 4 of Colossians, in verse 12, Epaphras, who is one of you, a servant of Christ. The word used for servant here is the Greek word doulos, which means slave. Now, in chapter 1, verse 7, the word minister is used. And while there's a lot of similarities here, there is a big difference as well. The word minister is the Greek word diakonos, which we get our word deacon from. And it has to do with someone who manages and oversees things. He's a minister, a servant in that capacity. But the difference in the word minister and this word slave or doulos here is duration. You see, a person who has become a minister may choose to end that relationship because in most cases that is a voluntary situation. They commit themselves to be a servant, maybe for X number of years or until the job is done or until they're just not satisfied with the employment any longer. But they can bring it to an end, the relationship. Whereas a slave has no such choice. A true slave, not only in Paul's day in New Testament times, but down through the history of man where there has been slavery, genuine slavery. When a person is a slave, they are under the total control and ownership of a master, and they can't just voluntarily say, I don't like this relationship any longer, I'm going to call it off. No, they can't do that. Well, in the same sense, when Paul and Epaphras both call themselves a slave of Christ, they have made themselves a voluntary slave of Christ, and there is no end to that relationship. So what I see here is Epaphras was committed for life to Christ. What a great thought that is. And folks, we're not in this for just short duration. I remember talking to a man here some time ago who came in and was looking for help, and I shared the gospel with him, and he said he wanted to be saved. I said, now listen, because of all the things he already had in his life, I said, this is not a Band-Aid for your problems. This is not just let me try this out and see how it works, and I'll think about it. No, I said, if you're really, truly wanting to be saved, it is a step in a direction that is for life, not a momentary time. So many people look at Christianity as just a Band-Aid to help with the problem, or I'll give it a try for a while, or we'll see how it works out. No, it's for life. And that was true with Epaphras. Now, the next thing that I see about Epaphras is his concern for others. Still in chapter 4, and we're still in verse number 12, and then we'll read on down to verse 13. But let's pick up again verse 12 of Colossians 4. Epaphras, who is one of you, a servant of Christ, saluteth you always, laboring fervently for you in prayers, that you may stand perfect and complete in the will of God. For I bear him record that he hath great zeal for you, and them that are in Laodicea, and them in Areopolis. The concern that Epaphras had for others is demonstrated in his willingness to pray earnestly for them. Now, there's a lot about prayer we could talk about today, but Epaphras was not the kind of guy that you go up to and said, "Hey, Epaphras, I'm really struggling. Would you pray for me?" He said, "Yeah, I will. I'll pray for you." And then he forgets all about it. Nor is he the kind that will say, "Well, okay, let's pray right now," and he'll ask God to bless you, sir. Well, then he forgets all about it. Now, he was committed to praying for them, laboring fervently in this. So let's just look at some thoughts here about prayer, okay? And if you want to write them down, it'd be good to help you to remember that. He prayed constantly. He says, always laboring fervently for you in prayer. He was not just praying when he felt like it, as do some Christians, but he was constantly praying for them. Now, there are people that I pray for on a regular basis, almost daily, okay? I won't say daily because there are times I miss, mentioning them, but there are some people that almost daily, almost every day, I pray for them. There are other people I pray for consistently on a weekly basis. I pray for a good number of pastors every Sunday morning, as I have pastored all these years. I want someone praying for me. I have a list of pastors that I pray for all over the country and even out of the country on Sunday morning. And I can't pray, for hours because I have, to get through and I have services and so forth. But I pray for them by name, and I ask God to bless them in the same way I would ask God to bless me. I'm going to preach. I'm going to pray for power and for clarity. I'm praying for, the services, that things will honor God. I pray for them in the same way. But it's constant. It's what we're doing. Then it says he prayed for them fervently, okay? The phrase laboring fervently is one word, and it means to put forth enormous effort, to agonize to achieve the goal. It's the same word that is used for the Lord when he's praying in the Garden of Gethsemane in Luke chapter 22 and verse 44, earnestly. We get the impression that prayer was a serious business with Epaphras. The word is used to describe athletes sometimes who give themselves fully to their sport. They exercise, they work, they strain because they want to win the crown, or they want to win the prize there. I think about this. If church members, if people in our church put as much concern and enthusiasm into their praying as they do in their favorite sports team, we'd have revival pretty quickly. And just to be honest, we can sit and we can watch a football game, a baseball game, a basketball game, or anything, soccer, golfing, whatever it may be. We can sit and watch it for hours. But do we pray for that? We're just determined. I can't miss that session. Boy, I can't miss that game. But do we have the same attitude about missing prayer in that capacity? He prayed fervently for them. Then he prayed definitely, okay? If you ask Epaphras, what are you praying for? Well, he said, this is what he says, that you may stand perfect and complete in the will of God. Simply, his great desire was that believers might mature in their Christian faith. That's something that we all need all the time, is to mature, continue to mature. I try to let people know that, no matter how long you've been saved, and I've been saved for over 50 years now, well 50 years, and I've pastored for over 50 years, but I know I still need maturity, because until I am with Jesus and like Jesus, I got a lot of work yet to do. And this is what he's praying for, that he might mature. He was concerned that they would mature and know the will of God. That again is important. What does God want you to do? And this is what he's praying for. This request carries the thought of being mature and perfectly assured in the will of God. Now, it's not necessary for believers to drift in life. We can know what God's will is, and we can enjoy God's will. And as a person learns the will of God and lives the will of God, he matures in his faith and experiences the fullness of God's life in us, okay? Then he prayed sacrificially, okay? Just keep that in mind, what we're saying. He prayed earnestly, all right? He prayed consistently, and now we read that he is praying specifically, all right? The word zeal, he said he prays with great zeal. It's not the normal word translated zeal. It means here pain and anguish. It's used in Revelation 16 and verse 10. They gnawed their tongues for pain. Now, I think about that, and here's what I see. Real prayer is difficult. It's not something we ought to feel bad about, and we don't have to wrestle with God to get him to answer our prayer. But it does mean we've got to show ourselves serious. We've got to throw ourselves into praying with zeal and concern. You see, if there is no burden, there can be no blessing. John Jowett said something about preaching one time. He said, preaching that costs nothing accomplishes nothing. Well, I would like to rephrase that and say this: praying that costs nothing accomplishes nothing. I am just impressed with Epaphras that he prayed with great zeal. And, I want to pray that way. I really do. I want to pray with great zeal. And then I'm impressed with the fact that he prayed for believers in 3 different cities, not only in Colossians, but in Laodicea and Areopolis. And he had people praying, or he was praying rather for people around all of Asia Minor there. Now, we're fortunate today if we just get our church members to pray for our church. What a great blessing if we were praying for other churches, praying for the churches across town, the churches in another city, and just really asking God to bless them in a great way. And so this is what I see about Epaphras now in our closing statement. His commitment to Christ, he was a servant, all right, committed for life. His prayer for others, or excuse me, his concern for others, he prayed. He prayed constantly, he prayed fervently, he prayed definitely, and he prayed sacrificially. In closing this series, and I'll finish here in just a second, what makes the difference in men like Epaphras and in this missionary like Bob Smith that I mentioned earlier? What's the difference in them to where their lives are an example to us? Why is it that some today wear the name of Christ? They call themselves Christians. They know all the right answers, but their life accomplishes nothing. Well, let me just mention this. First of all, men like Epaphras have a definite and ongoing relationship with Christ. They know they have been saved, and they are pursuing a daily relationship with Christ continuously there. There are many who say they are Christians, but they have never been saved. There are many who are saved, but they do not have a daily relationship with Jesus Christ. If you really want to make an impact in the world, you've got to have a daily, ongoing relationship with Jesus Christ. Secondly, he made a difference because he was involved. He wasn't just sitting around doing nothing. He wasn't just sitting in the pew letting everybody else do the work. He knew God had a plan and a purpose for his life, and he was involved, and he was committed to doing what God had given him to do. Well, thank you for listening again today. We'll pick up our study of Colossians in our next session, and we'll move a little further. We've been on chapter 1, verse 7 for a couple of sessions. But God bless each one of you.